With World War II ending on May 8, 1945, Allied forces turned their attention to the Japanese. 4 months later, on September 2, 1945, the Japanese also surrendered, thus ending World War II. With World War II over, the Cold War began. After World War II, two countries emerged as world superpowers. The US, which escaped World War II with comparatively few casualties and damage, were champions of democracy and capitalism. The other world superpower was the Soviet Union, which survived a Nazi invasion, had abundant natural resources, and swore to support communist uprisings the world over. Similar to the alliances that formed in the years before World War I and World War II, the world saw two alliances form in the beginning of the Cold War, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO was made up of the US and its allies, while the Warsaw Pact was made up of the Soviet Union and their allies. While not their greatest ally, China received aid from the Soviets when Mao Zedong brought communism to China. Fearful of the spread of communism, President Truman declared that the U.S. will support countries threatened by communism with economic and military aid. Now called the Truman Doctrine, this position became a guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War. When Kim Il-sung brought communism to Korea, the U.S. made good on their word and sent troops to the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War lasted over 3 years and ended with an armistice, with Korea being split into two nations at the 38th parallel. An even longer Cold War conflict was the Vietnam War, which occurred when Ho Chi Minh brought communism to Vietnam. The Vietnam War lasted over 19 years and saw heavy casualties on both sides. The war became extremely unpopular in the United States, and the United States finally withdrew forces in 1975. Raising the stakes during the Cold War was the threat of nuclear warfare. Both the US and the Soviet Union have massive stockpiles of these weapons that were capable of destroying entire cities and killing millions of people. The threat of communism and nuclear warfare found a home in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, when Fidel Castro led communist guerrilla forces in a takeover of Cuba in the 1950s. Obviously, the US was not thrilled with Castro's success. In response, President Kennedy authorized the training of Cuban exiles who attacked Cuba on April 17, 1961, with limited US support. Known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, this unsuccessful event proved extremely embarrassing for JFK and the US. The threat of nuclear war reached its height with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets planted nuclear missiles in Cuba. After an anxious 2 weeks of intense negotiations, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, while the US agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy. In doing so, the two nations avoided nuclear warfare. Meanwhile, in Europe, Berlin, which had been divided into a communist and democratic zone after World War II, had become a black eye for communism. West Berlin was much more prosperous under their capitalist and democratic government. To stop people from leaving, the East Germans built a wall that soon became a symbol of communist failure and oppression. Fortunately, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union started to crack. Pressure put on by the United States during the space race, along with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, in which the United States secretly supplied the Afghan fighters with weapons, weakened the Soviet Union severely. By 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down and Germany was unified. Finally, on December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, thus ending the Cold War.